webinar. So good morning, afternoon, or evening, everyone, depending on where you are. My name is Tina Mylly, and I work for the OCHA UNDP-led Connecting Business Initiative. As I was asking all the participants on the line to introduce themselves in the chat, I'll also add that I'm dialing in from Bangkok. We're hosting this webinar today with OCHA, the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, and of course CBI, that supports private sector networks before, during, and after emergencies. We have reserved an hour for this webinar, which means that we should have enough time at the end for questions and answers, but you can also engage in the conversation throughout the webinar through the chat box, or get a head start in posing questions by typing them in the Q&A box. We would love to know where everyone is from, so keep those messages coming. Thank you so much for joining today. Here you will see the agenda for today. So we will start with a brief introduction and cover some key concepts that many of you might already be familiar with, but we think they are important enough for us to also kind of give you a bit of a reminder. Then we'll move on to the main part of today's session and talk about the humanitarian coordination architecture, the actors, the system itself, and how and where the private sector fits in. After this, we will hear from two private sector representatives, so Hans-Peter and Veronica, on how they or their organizations engage with the humanitarian system, including the UN. Next slide, please. So here is our speaker lineup for today. So we have Sebastian Roth-Stampa, the chief of the emergency response section at OCHA. We have Hans-Peter Teufers, who is the director of international programs at the UPS Foundation. And then we'll have Veronica Gabaldon, who is the executive director of the Philippine Disaster Resilience Foundation, or PDRF, the CBI member network in the Philippines. Next slide, please. So we understand that the humanitarian system is sometimes difficult to navigate, and not only the humanitarian system, of course, but the UN in general. We have therefore developed a short business brief as an introduction to the humanitarian system. The document is now available on the CBI website, and we'll also share it with all of you after the session. Maybe some of the colleagues can actually even drop the link in the chat for you to take a look at. And we're organizing this webinar to help you, the private sector, gain a better understanding of who does what, where, why, and how. As mentioned, we will also cover some key concepts. And last but definitely not least, we hope that you will walk away from this session with a better understanding of the potential entry points for the private sector to contribute to humanitarian response. Maybe one disclaimer here, that today we will not focus on procurement or contractual opportunities with the UN, and if that's what you're mostly interested in, then we advise you to visit the UN Global Marketplace. Next slide, please. So we have a very brief Mentimeter exercise for you. Please grab your phones, or you can also use your laptop and go to menti.com and put the code 35321554. So go to menti.com and use the code 35321554. We would like you to answer one question, so it will be quick. Why would you, or why do you think it is important for you and your organization to engage with the humanitarian system? We will go and see all your answers anonymously. So please, everyone, just take the opportunity to share with the entire team, all the participants here, why you think it's important for your company, your organization to engage with the humanitarian system. We'll give you a a couple of minutes to respond, and we should also see the results as they come in. Karim, would you like to? Perfect. So we're seeing here some of the, like a little bit of a word cloud on what you have responded. So some really great ones here: social responsibility, economic stability, common humanity, preparedness, corporate foundation, risk reduction, save lives, international peace, facilitate process. And if you haven't yet gone to Menti, you can see the URL on top of the slide, so menti.com, and the code there if you would still like to participate. Accountability, definitely. Solidarity, better coordination, did I already say that? Security. Add value also. These are really great. Anyone else? Maybe that's it. It looks like, oh, there we see. Okay, that's great. Now I'm trying to identify which one was that. Which one have I not said yet? But you can see this is really wonderful. And all of these are obviously absolutely great reasons to engage with a humanitarian system. Accountability, prevention, risk reduction, peace, sustainability, quick response, saving lives, super important. We will, you can continue to add more words here, and we will take note of them also after the webinar. So you can keep Menti open if you wish, but thank you. Let's continue with the presentation. So here are some of the reasons why humanitarian coordination with the private sector is so important from our perspective. Different actors are really needed to support people in need. The humanitarian needs are so great and increasing all the time that no one actor can address them alone. Businesses, on the other hand, are part of the social fabric and often among the first responders after a crisis. So coordination between different actors, including with the private sector, can significantly improve the scale and overall quality of humanitarian response, because it helps with a number of things. It helps with identifying needs, addressing gaps and reducing duplication. On the other hand, it can also clarify roles and responsibilities among actors, and overall just kind of expand the scope and impact of interventions. Next slide, please. Now, let's look at some of the key concepts that we're highlighting here. There are more in the business brief that was mentioned, but we thought it would be good to remind you of three, starting with the humanitarian principles. The work of humanitarian organizations is guided by four principles: humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence. These provide the foundations for humanitarian action and are critical for establishing and maintaining access to affected people, whether in a natural hazard context or in a scenario that is more human-induced. Therefore, they also apply to the private sector, all organizations involved. The principles are also critical elements of effective humanitarian coordination. Next slide, please. The concept of do no harm, many of you already are familiar with. It's really the starting point for everything. Essentially, it means that all organizations need to acknowledge the consequences, both intended and unintended, of their work in a given area, and aim to minimize the negative and maximize the positive impacts. Just because our intentions as humanitarians or as private sector entities are good and pure, it does not mean that our interventions would not create or have the potential to escalate tensions. We have created a guidance note on conflict sensitivity in private sector disaster management and also organized a webinar on this. So if you are interested in learning more, you can find those resources on the CBI website. Next slide, please. The last concept for today is accountability to affected populations, or AAP. It talks about engaging and empowering the affected people themselves and really ensuring that they have a voice in all of decision making. Next slide, please. I will now turn it over to Sebastian, who will provide an overview of the humanitarian coordination architecture. So Sebastian, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much indeed, Tina. And I see it's getting pretty late where you are as well. So many thanks for taking the time to be with us and to shepherd us through this process. Colleagues, my name is Sebastian Rose-Stamper. I've been in the United Nations for 20 years and involved in these sorts of operations for 30. And I'm the chief of the emergency response section at the Office of the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs in Geneva. And I spot a couple of old friends online, so you know who you are. Nice to see you. OCHA is the part of the United Nations that's responsible for coordinating global emergency response to save lives and protect people in humanitarian crises. And those might be sudden onset natural disasters like earthquakes or tsunamis or weather phenomena, or it might be in protracted crisis, a shooting war, that sort of thing. Essentially, we bring partners together in preparedness response to ensure that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And I'll talk about the needs that exist in a moment, and you'll see why that's necessary. So our primary objective in engaging with the private sector in humanitarian settings is to help address gaps and improve the overall effectiveness of humanitarian response. And the quote you see there on the slide is from the Under-Secretary General of the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs and the Emergency Relief Coordinator, a Welshman called Martin Griffiths, just noting that we reached 107 million people in 2021, and we're going to have to do a little bit better in 2022. So let's have a look at what we're dealing with, what the scope and scale of the problem is. Well, there it is, people in need. We've calculated through a process that we do annually that there are about 274 million people in need of humanitarian assistance and protection around the world in 2022. We will target 183 million of those. The disparity between the two figures is that other organizations will take care of the balance. And we're going to require about $41 billion to do that. 2022 is a new high for humanitarian needs. 1 in 29 people globally will need humanitarian assistance and protection across the world as a result of ongoing conflicts, more frequent and severe natural disasters and climate-related disasters, and all of this compounded by the devastating effects and impacts of the pandemic. If you take just one country, Yemen, you're looking at a country of about 30 million people. 20 million of those are in need of some sort of humanitarian assistance or protection. So 2 out of every 3 Yemenis. Of those 20 million, 12 million are in acute need, living on less than $1 a day with no access to public services, limited access to markets, food, and other essentials. Now, nobody, looking at the scale of the issue we're talking about, nobody can address these needs alone. And the private sector is a critical partner in helping governments, the UN, and its partners help the most vulnerable. Let's have a look at how we do that. Well, if you look on the left-hand side, you can see the national level of response, and there are all sorts of people there. There's the host government, there's the Emergency Management Authority, the NDMA or NDMO, National Disaster Management Office. Domestic militaries often have a part to play. The media has a part to play. They're non-governmental organizations at the national level, the Red Cross and Red Crescent Society, and of course the private sector. Bear in mind always that it's the affected people and organizations are often the first to respond to disasters. And indeed, the government and national actors have the primary responsibility for initiating, organizing, coordinating, and implementing humanitarian assistance within their territory. However, If international response and support is requested, then it's absolutely essential that there's effective coordination at the global, regional, and national levels, which underpin all elements of humanitarian response. So coordination helps in identifying needs, in addressing gaps, in clarifying roles and responsibilities amongst actors, and expanding the scope and impact of interventions, and reducing any duplication that might occur. That's ultimately why it's important that we all understand how a humanitarian system works. Incidentally, just looking at the elements on the right-hand side there, they're almost identical. IFRC and ICRC, the donors, member states, UN agencies, funds and programs, international non-governmental organizations, the military should be there, media, and once again, the private sector. Please note that when engaging, private sector engagement should be conducted through networks wherever possible. And those networks then link to humanitarian response mechanisms rather than through individual companies, simply because collective action has more impact. Now, if you take, for example, the OCHA UNDP Connecting Business Initiative private sector member networks, these are integrated into local response mechanisms, and indeed in one case, and we'll hear about this a little bit later, are integrated into the local humanitarian country team. What's really important as we respond is that people remain at the center of the response. We call that accountability to affected people, as you heard earlier on, both for their increased engagement and empowerment and decision-making in order to address their specific needs, and in order to ensure that international response remains accountable to them. And particularly, we watch nowadays for any sort of abuse that might take place during these operations. And there have been some fairly well documented examples of sexual exploitation and abuse, which we have a zero tolerance policy on. What OCHA does in this landscape is act as a neutral facilitator and broker, and we can facilitate introductions to you or for you to the UN agencies, funds and programs, to NGOs, to clusters in your respective sector. And we can assist in explaining what's happening on the ground and answer any questions. Now, later in the presentation, you'll hear from Hans-Peter at UPS, who's been a very valued partner at the international level for many organizations, and from Veronica from the Philippine Disaster Resilience Foundation, the PDRF, who is a member of the Connecting Business Initiative in the Philippines and can highlight the importance of the work that they do at the country level. Let's have a little look at how this is all organized at the country level. You know, there's a wonderful idea that the United Nations and the aid community, which is much larger than the United Nations, is this wonderful, homogenous, well-organized whole. Well, it's not. It is quite disparate, it's quite bitty, and there are lots of different pieces to it. And the way we get by that, the way we pull all of this together and make it work, is at the global level, we have something called the Emergency Relief Coordinator. I mentioned him, he's this Welshman, Martin Griffiths. Now, he is the senior UN official working on humanitarian affairs, and he reports directly to the Secretary General. Now, with him, he has the principles of the United Nations and the humanitarian partners. So the Secretary General, for instance, of the Red Cross, Red Crescent Society, the Executive Director of the World Food Programme, or of the High Commissioner for Refugees, or UNICEF, the Children's Fund, and so on and so forth. They collectively are responsible for the oversight of all emergencies requiring international humanitarian assistance. And as and when required, the ERC, the Emergency Relief Coordinator, will appoint something called a humanitarian coordinator. So at the country level, which is where the rubber hits the road, what essentially you have is a UN resident coordinator. So wherever the UN has a presence, you have a UN resident coordinator. And he heads up the UN country team and is the government's first point of contact with the United Nations. And 9 times out of 10, they will be engaged and involved in development-driven activities. They'll be looking at working with the host government to make improvements to the education system or to the health system, and so on and so forth. Now, when a disaster occurs, or in a particularly disaster-prone country, or in a particularly crisis-prone country, or in a protracted crisis, that resident coordinator, more often than not, is appointed as the humanitarian coordinator. And the UN country team still exists, but it also is re-rolled to something called the humanitarian country team. And that becomes the government's first point of contact on disaster response. And their responsibility essentially is to oversee the humanitarian response and coordination amongst the relevant humanitarian agencies. And that again is the agencies, funds and programs. The Red Cross, Red Crescent are a standing invitee. There might be a CBI business network sitting on that team. and various others. So moving swiftly onwards, they work through a system called the clusters, and the clusters were introduced about 10 years ago, slightly longer maybe, during one of our reform periods. And the cluster system were designed to introduce accountability and predictability into the system. So clusters are groups of humanitarian organizations that focus on the main sectors of humanitarian action thematically. So the thematic clusters, there are 12 of them, are, let's take the 4 you see most commonly in any disaster response: WASH, water, sanitation and hygiene, shelter, health and food security. Those are the 4 you always get in a big disaster. Each cluster is managed by a cluster lead agency, and clusters basically are a temporary solution at the height of a crisis to coordinate international emergency response until the humanitarian emergency phase ends and national development-oriented coordination mechanisms can be resumed or re-established. There are clear criteria for activating clusters and for deactivating clusters. Furthermore, when 2 or more clusters have been activated, you then have an inter-cluster coordination group or an intersector coordination group that brings together the various clusters that you have working in order to collaborate on the operational response. And that's kind of a no-brainer if you're dealing with, as I was a couple of years ago in Mozambique, an affected population of 1.8 million, a targeted population of about 1 million. And you're doing deliveries, you kind of want to make sure people get a broad range of services that are life-saving, life-sustaining, rather than ending up with a very smart tent and nothing else. Now, private sector engagement is sometimes coordinated through structures such as the Connecting Business Initiative, member networks, or through the UN Global Compact local networks, or simply through chambers of commerce, business associations, or other collective action platforms. In some countries, as I said, these networks are invited to have a seat at the humanitarian country team, and that really makes planning and response a heck of a lot easier. There is also a new tool in the resident coordinators' offices. It's a new position created in the last 2 years called the Partnership and Development Finance Officer, the PDFO. And this is a new cohort of partnership experts who provide matchmaking, brokering, strategy, and advisory support to UN country teams while assisting external stakeholders to identify opportunities for local engagement. And we'd be more than happy to assist in putting you in touch with them. Any of you who wanted to like to engage in a response can reach out to the OCHA private sector focal point, who acts as a neutral broker to introduce you to the relevant UN agency fund program or NGO or cluster. And then you can mutually decide whether you want to work with them or not, or you can reach out to the Connecting Business Initiative, and those contact details will be provided to you at the end of this. Now, how do we work? We've got the structure. How does the actual system work? Well, we've got essentially something called the humanitarian program cycle. And that sets out the sequence of actions that need to be taken to prepare for, plan, manage, deliver, and monitor collective humanitarian responses. And this is the way that we identify or help to identify the sort of critical needs, develop the response plan, and determine the budget required to sustain them. If you look at this cycle, then it works for both preparedness and response. At the top of the circle, let's say the disaster happens just off to the left of the top, you go through a needs assessment and analysis process to determine A, what the critical needs are, and B, whether or not there are any vulnerable groups which you should prioritize. That then goes down the ways off to the right into strategic planning, where you determine how you are going to respond, what part of the response is useful for you in support of government. You then go through a process of resource mobilization, and then you have implementation. And as you implement, as you run programs out to the field, you're constantly monitoring to ensure that they're actually working. And then we use a system called the operational peer review and evaluation to course correct, to ensure that we're doing the right thing. That seems fairly laborious. Again, I was out in Haiti not that long ago doing a response to a tropical hurricane, sorry, in that part of the world. and the needs assessment, strategic planning, resource mobilization, and implementation and monitoring should take you no more than 72 hours to get your initial aid to the people who need it most. If you take longer than 72 hours, you're going to start losing people. Now, the approach is based on best practices that we've learned from the field and aims to achieve the following. Firstly, a stronger emphasis on the needs of the affected people. So pull, not push, not pushing what we think should go into a response, making sure we get the right things and pull them into a response. Improve targeting of the most vulnerable, increase funding for humanitarian priorities, and greater accountability of humanitarian actors and donors for collective results. The outputs of all of these things, all of these plans in a sudden onset natural disaster would be a flash appeal. It comes out 3 or 4 days after the disaster strikes. It essentially outlines what the priority action is going to be and how we're going to achieve that, and puts a monetary figure to that. In protracted crises, complex emergencies, we use something called a humanitarian needs overview and humanitarian response plan, which is a slightly more laborious effort. Which again identifies the critical shortfalls and gaps and then seeks to fill them with capacity in country or additional capacity if we need it. Now, those are all publicly available. You can see, for instance, when I was talking about Yemen, you can see the Yemen response plan, HNO and HRP, online at humanitarianresponse.info, and they're actually quite an interesting read. As noted earlier, the national government leads response efforts through the national coordination mechanisms, and these are the adjunct to that. We are the addition. That said, these flash appeals and HRPs do have prioritized needs, and we'd encourage companies to engage with and support projects and organizations within those documents, which in turn will support a coordinated response. Where can the private sector help most? My experience is, and again, going back to Mozambique, it wasn't a particularly joined up response. We were dealing with a lot of individual companies, but their local knowledge very much shaped the response, the way in which we responded to the critical needs of the population at risk. And they provided a huge amount of capacity, quite apart from contextual knowledge, in all sorts of areas. So sharing data, participating in assessments, providing financial or in-kind resources, deploying experts, and particularly using their voice to advocate for additional support. We various success stories. The PDRF I won't bore on about, because I think I'll leave that to Veronica, who should be rightly proud of what PDRF do. But just looking at Vanuatu at the beginning of 2020, we've a really good example of where a network has worked extremely well. Cyclone Harold, which is tropical cyclone Cat 5, struck Vanuatu in April 2020, just after the islands had shut down. I don't know if you know Vanuatu, but it's sort of 82 islands in a long chain. And that meant essentially that we couldn't get our response teams in, we couldn't ship goods and services into the affected area. So Vanuatu was on its own. Thank goodness then we had worked very hard with the CBI member network there, the Vanuatu Business Resilience Council, the VBRC. And all credit to them for their extraordinary hard work in mobilizing in support of the National Disaster Management Authorities, in conducting assessments of the far-flung reaches of the island, in supplying over 35 tons of food and non-food items to over 1,000 remote coastal households. Very much a case of a success story for CBI, but a fairly simple example of how business networks can make a real difference in response when they're needed most. I'm sorry, I'm going slightly over time, so I will just wrap up here. I think the needs are so great that we are not going to be able to deal with them in a disparate fashion. We need to work together in a coordinated way to improve the scale and overall quality and impact of humanitarian response operations. To make humanitarian action efficient, we can work together through mechanisms like the CBI member networks, like the Global Compact, like Chambers of Commerce. I was in Haiti a couple of months ago. They had an earthquake in the Grand Sud. Very sadly, a number of people were killed. It came on top of a number of existing vulnerabilities. The same area had been hit by Hurricane Matthew a couple of years ago, 4 or 5 years ago. And the situation was really quite desperate. There was banditry on the road, which meant that access was hard. There was only one helicopter flying, various compounding issues. But I mean, I'm delighted to say that the CBI network in Haiti, the Alliance for Risk Management and Business Continuity, which is a local business federation, and a part of CBI immediately mobilise its members to provide drinkable water, fuel, solar panels, clothing, and other essentials to affected communities. We all have a responsibility as human beings to help each other out, and it's moments like that that you can sit and say, well, you know, crikey, it's fairly clear to me where the private sector belongs in crisis response and how valuable they can be. Listen, thanks so much for joining today. Please let us know if you have any questions. I think we'll take those at the end, and you'll hear from my esteemed colleagues next. But back to you now, Tina.
Many thanks, Sebastian, for having summarized something as complex as the humanitarian coordination architecture in such a practical, but also I would say honest way, including through the many examples. I hope our audience also feels like they now have a better understanding of the different layers of the system and where the private sector fits in. Next, we will hear from our private sector partners on how all of this plays out in the contexts in which they have operated or continue to operate. We'll start with Hans-Peter, who will explain why and how the UPS Foundation works with the humanitarian system. Hans-Peter, the floor is yours.
Tina, thanks a lot. Appreciate. We will have to make a little bit of time up, I think. So before we talk about the why, let's talk about the how. And if you please be so kind and provide my first slide, thank you. Thank you very much. So how do we work with humanitarian organizations? Well, we are trying to deliver impact as the UPS Corporation, where the foundation is the charitable arm. So we are trying to combine the strengths that the foundation has, and then, of course, the strengths that the corporation has, with more than 500,000 people around the globe employed in an unprecedented network, logistical and supply chain network, which is helping a lot, especially in crisis. So where the corporation is trying to provide exceptional service, the foundation is trying to help to strengthening the social systems we are living in. That's the core of the work that we are doing, strengthening the social systems and the communities we are living in. And we have a strategy that we have developed over the past months, which is pretty new, and you see it here. It goes with the acronym HELP, which is reading help, and so that describes quite well what we are trying to provide, providing help where it is needed around the globe. And so you see the 4 pillars that we are following. Now, the new strategy that we are having is centering a lot around equity and justice through all 4 areas here. But the most relevant aspects here are with the health and humanitarian relief program. We are trying to improve the well-being of people and communities by leveraging partnerships and innovative logistical expertise, delivering health, humanitarian solutions to underserved and impacted communities. And you will hear that a lot more, underserved and impacted communities. That's what we are looking for. In the equity and economic empowerment section, we are investing in organizations that address systemic education and economic barriers and create opportunities for the same underserved and underrepresented core groups, which are, from our understanding, women, youth, and marginalized communities. The local community engagement, leveraging human capital to inspire and mobilize volunteers and volunteer work, and help organizations to deliver a systemic impact to their local communities. And last but not least, planet protection, where we are trying to advance the environmental justice and a sustainable world. Now, next slide, please, Tina. Our mission to deliver pathways to empower resilient, just, and safe communities is related to the communities, as I said. And the approach that we are following is to strategically invest into, first of all, systemic change organizations, directly work with service organizations, develop collaborative partnerships. Those are usually long-standing, and as well try to find ways to leverage thought leadership opportunities with these organizations. This usually drives as well systemic change. Next slide, please. Thank you. I would use the health and humanitarian relief section to explain a little bit on what we are doing and how we are doing it and why, especially why. So first of all, humanitarian organizations, the UNs, and as well the Red Cross and Red Crescent infrastructure is everywhere. So it allows us access, and that's very relevant for us as a global corporation and a global organization as well. We are touching on 5 SDGs here with the Health and Humanitarian Relief Program, the SDGs 2, 3, 10, 11, and 17, trying to create a long-term impact as well with the activities we are undertaking, and we are working with a lot of different organizations. On one hand, on the UN side, with UNHCR, with UNICEF, with UNDRR, the World Food Program, UN OCHA, UNDP, and some others, and with INGOs like CARE, the Salvation Army, and then of course as well with the Red Cross and Red Crescent network. The one thing that is really relevant for us is, beside global access, is that we are sharing the same values as the organizations where we are working with. One of the very relevant aspects of our humanitarian work is to let's say collaborate with corporate imperatives as well. One of it is healthcare. The other is small and medium-sized businesses and organizations, for instance, like CBI, Connecting Business Initiatives, where the support is on the ground, helps as well, especially to follow this pathway to support small and medium-sized business who are usually the most vulnerable in case of emergency, and those that are most affected. And so therefore, organizations like platforms like CBI, and there are a few others, are extremely relevant for the support on the ground to build resilience, to organize relief, and then of course as well to help with the recovery work, trying to make it better, we'll build back better for the next time. So thanks for listening, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thanks so much, Hans-Peter. One of the points that you mentioned was also what Sebastian highlighted earlier as being really critical. So keeping those who have been affected by crisis at the center of response efforts, or in your words, the underserved and impacted communities. And for this reason, but also for many others, we are really grateful as OCHA and CBI to have you, the UPS Foundation, as our partner now for many years. So thank you so much. Our last presentation today is from Veronica, who will provide an overview of how the Philippine Disaster Resilience Foundation, or PDRF, works with the humanitarian system. And we hope that she will also explain the journey that has taken them to where they are today, highlighting also the role that they play in some of these coordination structures. Veron, please go ahead.
Thank you, Tina. Good day to all of you. PDRF, or Philippine Disaster Resilience Foundation, is a nonprofit organization in the private sector focused on disaster risk reduction management here in the Philippines. So we were actually formed in 2010 in the aftermath of Typhoon Ketsana, which flooded almost the entire national capital region of the Philippines. The focus then was that the recovery and rehabilitation efforts jointly undertaken by the government and private sector under PDRF. And in 2013, the unprecedented devastation brought about by Super Typhoon Haiyan saw the beginning of our strong collaboration with the UN agencies, global donors, and embassies working together to deliver recovery and rehabilitation interventions, from temporary shelter, livelihood, water and sanitation, education, infrastructure, and environment. It was UN OCHA who opened the doors for us to work with various UN agencies such as UNDP, UNICEF, WFP, IOM, and others. PDRF expanded its network, further strengthened its leadership and organization, and made a deliberate shift to preparedness to build disaster resilience. And in 2014, we changed our name to Resilience from Recovery. At this point, this is where the collaboration with humanitarian agencies was further deepened as we created capacity building programs, incorporating humanitarian principles across our DRR programs, particularly during response and recovery. And as we have been invited to represent the private sector in the UN Humanitarian Country Team and the National Disaster Risk Reduction Management Council, we regularly also join rapid damage assessment and needs analysis during emergencies. As private sector, one of our key realizations is that in order to prepare for and respond to disasters in a timely manner, we need to establish a monitoring and a response coordination mechanism for the private sector. I think this is why, as explained by Tina and also by Sebastian earlier, that the best way to work as a private sector is through a network, so that coordination and collaboration would be much easier and faster. So in PDRF, the idea of building a private sector-led operations center to harmonize private sector efforts in DRRM was realized in 2016 as PDRF built a prototype EOC, and in 2018, the newly constructed EOC in Clark, Pampanga was inaugurated. You will see in the slide lower left photo, that's our that's our emergency operations center. The facility is available to our member companies and the UNHCT as a backup site during response. And in 2016, during the World Humanitarian Summit, PDRF helped launch the Connecting Business Initiative, or CBI, with PDRF as its model network. CBI and PDRF have been working closely in supporting and strengthening the private sector response efforts before, during, and after emergencies. CBI actually celebrated its 5th anniversary this year and featured some of PDRF's work, including interventions in Marawi, a conflict area in Mindanao, the one-stop digital hub for MSME called CCUP, and the Public Service Continuity Program for local government and hospitals. And during response, especially the recent one, what we call the typhoons Goni and Vamco, PDRF was part of the humanitarian needs and the priorities document with specific chapter on private sector. And PDRF and its private sector network, as well as representatives from the embassies of Germany and Netherlands, traveled to the affected areas to oversee the delivery of relief goods in the affected areas. We also participated in fact-finding mission to survey and assess the impact of those 2 typhoons later last year. PDRF also, together with a humanitarian system, builds bridges. Number 1 is we bring in non-traditional humanitarian actors in the fold and capacitating them to be able to contribute significantly to humanitarian action. One is the private sector. We bring together big businesses who are able to set aside commercial interests to collaborate on delivering aid and building resilience during crisis. And recently, we worked with diaspora. PDRF has collaborated with IOM, Washington, D.C., Philippines, USAID, and to create the global framework for diaspora engagement and humanitarian assistance, which aims to better leverage the efforts of diaspora communities and their positive contribution in humanitarian assistance. This framework was presented during World Humanitarian Day this year, and a virtual tabletop exercise was facilitated by PDRF and IOM to test the effectiveness of the entry points and coordination pathways among the private or the partner organizations. So in closing, PDRF is proud to have paved the way for the private sector to play a significant role in the UN humanitarian system. And over the years, we have learned that holistic approach is the best way to contend with a crisis, and by engaging and capacitating all actors, traditional or non-traditional, and integrating them into a system that is comprehensive and inclusive. Thank you very much for having me here, Tina. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Veron. I know it's almost midnight there, so we really appreciate you joining us for
it's
this
holiday
webinar.
tomorrow. I can have a good rest.
No, but it's really great for you know, to hear how PDRF has evolved as an organization, and how your scope also has expanded over the years. And PDRF obviously is a great example of the power of collective action. And I liked how you talked about the organization or the platform building bridges between, of course, different companies, but also different stakeholders. So thanks so much for doing that. So we have now come to the end of this presentation, and the remaining 10 or so minutes is dedicated for discussion with the audience. If you have any questions, or if you would like to share any experiences working with the humanitarian system and the private sector, you can raise your hand and unmute yourself to speak, or then you can also write questions, and well, I guess questions in the Q&A box, and comments also in the chat. So please don't hesitate. This time is really for you to clarify if there was anything that was unclear, or for to ask more information about the different examples that our panelists here presented. Maybe as we wait, I'm kind of trying to scroll. I see there is Riyadh Sidat. You have raised your hand. I think it would be great if you spoke and posed your question. Nora, can you maybe help from the back end?
Good morning, Tina. Good morning, colleagues. I don't know if you can hear me well.
Yes, we can hear you very well.
Good. This question is for Sebastian. I work currently in Mozambique, not in Mozambique, in a crisis responding to the Cabo Delgado crisis. Through the response, we see a lot of private sector, philanthropist private sector, who do a lot of distributions across the province. So due to they're well connected, and they provide assistance immediately after big shocks like Palma, like Musima da Praia. So we, as a humanitarian community, we are having difficulties in understanding what kind of distributions they do and how we can engage with them in a practical sense, because one of the core mandate of OCHA is to reduce duplication, avoid inconsistency on the ground. So how we, as a humanitarian community, can practically engage with the private sector in responding, understanding from them what kind of distributions they are doing. Of course, there's the issue of due diligence on sometimes with trust with the private sector. There was some talks in the beginning of the year, but then it faded away, on how we can truly create a mechanism of information sharing, on minimal coordination, because after some couple of distribution can be done in a non-effective way, can create issues related to PSEA and all other issues that comes after post-distribution. So how we can, humanitarian community, have that create that mechanism to pull the private sector to us, so we can have this information sharing between us. Thank you for the presentation once again to all. This is a it's timely for in the current context that we live in, because we need to join forces to get assistance to affected people. Thank you.
Thank you, Riyadh. I mean, I'll answer directly if I may. Firstly, very nice to speak to you, and I hope that Cabo Delgado is treating you well. I know the region fairly well. I think two things occur to me here. I mean, firstly, it's wonderful that there is still that generosity and philanthropy going on in Cabo Delgado. It's not an entirely uncomplicated response. You know, that there needs to be a degree of conflict-sensitive programming, and I can understand your concerns when you talk about a lack of coordination. I think coordination needs to take place in both Maputo and in Pemba. And I also, you may or may not know that there's an OCHA office opening in Mozambique in January 2022. I'd be more than happy to chat with you offline about this, but essentially, I think that there needs to be two engagement strands, both in as I say, Maputo and Pemba. I think if you build it, they will come. If you have a forum through which private sector partners can engage, then I suggest that you would attract the right type of engagement. Going through the local chamber of commerce in Pemba is also an option. It used to be quite strong when I was there, and the mayor was a leading figure in that. So that's another thing you might consider. But certainly for the detail, I'd really be more than happy to talk to you and introduce you to our team who's going up there. Over.
Many thanks, Sebastian. I also wanted to check, obviously the context is very different, but Veronica, if you had anything that you wanted to add to this from the obviously different context from the Philippines in terms of kind of the mechanisms for information sharing and coordination, but maybe also some of the incentives that you have thought have worked particularly well in terms of kind of getting the private sector involved.
Yes, the private sector, especially the big ones, are really the first on the ground, and they have the capacity, they have the resources to help. The role of the humanitarian actor there is to make sure that there is equitable distribution of assistance. That's the role. That's the importance of having a network and having a coordinating platform. So you can. That could be the central idea of that platform to gather the private sector and rally behind that effort, because more often than not, they will only rely on what they read on the newspaper, they see on the TV. But with a coordinating platform, a coordinating body, giving them timely information, accurate data, that will actually give them more information or leverage to decide where to bring their assistance. So that's the importance. That's how PDRF was able to mobilize the private sector and able to harmonize the effort in a coordinated manner, bringing together the other stakeholders as well, especially the government, the national government agencies, and the local government units. So the coordinating mechanism is very important. Thank you.
Thank you, Veronica. Participants, I'm browsing through to see if anyone has raised their hand. Please don't hesitate. This is your chance to ask questions. And I'm also I wanted to see if we still have Faye on the line. Yes, Faye, I see you're still there. Just before we started, I said that it would also be great to hear from your experience having worked for and with the private sector in Nigeria. Faye, would you like to just share some quick insights? And Nara, if I can again, yes. Hi, Faye, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you, Tina. Hello, everybody. Can you hear me?
Very well, thank you.
Okay, so long time ago, I had met Tina when I was managing the Global Compact Network in Nigeria and also working for a big private sector entity that was a research think tank and had that convening power. The one or two pointers that I would like to share is that you find out that most times the private sector, depending on the context, would usually like to respond to help save lives and to help vulnerable people. But to do that, they need information. Information is very key. What has also then happened within the Nigerian context is that the philanthropy field is beginning to expand, it's beginning to change. And then so therefore you have many of these big corporates who are now having foundations that are similar to the UPS foundations. And so many of them have begun to find within either the niche of CSR or the bigger niche of sustainability to ensure that, okay, we are only good and in business if the environment within which we work is actually working. And so that's one of the things that has really come to fore in a couple of years that I had worked with the private sector. Now moving from the private sector into OCHA, what you then find out is this real reality on ground is that the private sector also does help. Still, information is also key. They're always looking for where to make a mark and have that their brand name as a household name. You have most of them, for example, the telecommunications, a particular telecommunications company in Nigeria had helped to restore and rebuild telecommunication masts in the northeast of Nigeria, not only just to help rebuild livelihoods there, but it also helps the humanitarian community in terms of communications assets. If you do not have these assets, it also makes communication difficult. And so at the end of the day, it's very important to strike partnerships that work. You need to find that niche where you add, where they seem to be getting value, and communication could be one of those values. And I'm also very happy about the UN marketplace. For those of them who are not really into these kind of things, another value proposition would be the UN marketplace for them, because anything that the private sector can do is more than welcome. I will stop at this point. Thank you.
Many thanks, Faye. It's great that we also got the opportunity to hear from you and some insights from Nigeria. We're running out of time, but I do want to still give the opportunity for Jacob to come in and pose his question or share his insights. Jacob, can you hear us?
Loud and clear, Tina. Thank you. I hope you can hear me as well.
Yes, we can.
Good. I totally agree with, sorry, my quick introduction, Jacob. I've had the pleasure of being part of the UNDAC system under OCHA for 12, 13 years now. I've also had the pleasure to meet Veronica 2016 when we were doing our larger operations with Unilever, setting up, let's say, an SME training capacity for about 1,000 SME leaders out there. Based on that, actually, it's been a long way in the private sector. And from what I've heard, especially what you say, Faye, who to approach and how, and quick response, the communication issue and so on. My question is still, I always seem to see that it's top-down driven. It's difficult to find the other mechanism to find how do we get it from bottom up. Especially from the Philippines, I saw that the situation when we were going out to parts of the country to see how did exactly, to see how did the small enterprises, medium enterprises wanted to engage in disasters. And like you said, Faye, they want to engage very quickly. They want to get on very early in this part, not only necessarily with monetary, but actually they had bulldozers, they had pumps, they had buses or tractors or something that they could engage with. And their frustration was always very much that they had to wait 3-5 days before they were sort of could fit into a system, existing systems. I think PDRF has done amazing work in the Philippines. They're also very privileged in the sense that how they've set up their structure, which is very unique, I would say, to the Philippines. Not many countries can copy that. But my question is, and based on what my Unilever or our experience with you, Veronica, was that later on, I was dealing with other countries in Africa and Middle East, where we started seeing a lot of interest also from the private sector. And I started doing research on associations, clubs that were very keen. So I would say there's a big market, to use the wrong expression, as to use people, organizations like the Rotary Club, Lions Club, it could be community membership clubs, religious groups, and other sort of associations that are specific. I've worked with Rotary indirectly, and they, for one, are very, very keen on this. So I'm just saying there's an opportunity here to maybe push from bottom up. Not that's a critique of the other one, but let's say maybe you can hit masses in another way by going through a club, because each, like a Rotary Club, they have They have this commonality of being part of a club, and that's why they have their communication system already in place, and they would know which capacities and resources they have individually. I've spoken far too much. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Jacob. And definitely, maybe just 2 sentences, and then I'll turn it over to the panelists. Definitely, I think there are some, you mentioned Rotary, religious groups, and other structures who we collectively, CBI member networks as well, could work more closely with. And I know that some of the networks already do. So maybe I'll just check first with Veronica, if you wanted to respond to this one, and maybe share also some of the ways how you are working with these different kind of structures and I guess getting the push from bottom up. But then I would also like to still give the floor to Sebastian and also to Hans-Peter, because I know Hans-Peter and the UPS Foundation works very closely also with SMEs on, for example, business continuity planning. So very quickly, maybe in 1 minute or so, if you could respond to this question, and then we'll wrap up. Veronica?
Thank you, Tina, and nice to hear from you, Jacob. It's been a long time. So localization is really a very big discussion right now in the Philippines. And even before that, PDRF realizes that as we continue to operate nationwide, we cannot be there. We cannot be immediately in all these affected areas. So early on, we already built partnerships on the ground. So what we do is that when strategic partnerships in areas where highly vulnerable areas. So we have partnerships there that when something happens, we can immediately contact them and we can do coordination. Information will immediately flow back to us, okay, and which we share to the network so that they know immediately what is happening on the ground and get their resources ready to support. So localization is a program right now, a very PDRF in partnership with Office of Civil Defense and the local NGOs as well as the UNHCT in the country. Thank you.
Hans-Peter?
Yeah, thank you, Tina. Jacob, I think any type of bottom-up approach is welcome in case of an emergency, because the one that is affected is not asking where the help is coming from. So the most reasonable is the help is there. So therefore, using any type of an organization in case of an emergency is great. However, it's of course good to, let's say, have something organized up front in order to avoid redundancies. And avoiding redundancies, especially in case of emergency, is something as well the humanitarian organizations on the ground know very well, where you have this unsolicited donations, where you got tons of stuff that you don't need. Just giving you one example, which I heard from a partner from the World Food Program in the Caribbean, when a disaster struck there, and then a lot of US Americans were sending out refrigerators because they heard that the fridges were gone. And so I think the market for refrigerators in that particular island is not good for any trader anymore for the next 10 years because they have so many. So it doesn't make sense. So avoiding redundancy is something that we can do if we have planning. So therefore, this type of organizations like CBI, like Arise, like Global Compact or whatsoever, as long as they are focusing as well on relief in this aspect here, play a vital role to make sure that you are avoiding redundancies, that there is a common access point, and that at the end of the day you have a coordinated approach, because usually when preparing as well, the organization is preparing with the government, who has the first role in disaster relief. So therefore, it is good doing it. It is better to prepare or be prepared. And a good way of doing it is, for instance, working with CBI and others. Thank you.
Sebastian, any final observations on this?
I'm 7 minutes late for another call, but look, Jacob, thank you very much indeed. It's a good observation, and you and I have spoken about similar things before. I think one of the key lessons coming out of any network, whether it's a business network or anything else, is to build on what's already there. Build on the naturally formed networks. Don't try to create what isn't there. And I think we've all learned lessons in various areas of engagement. When you try and create these false networks, they just don't happen. When you look at the humanitarian and business landscape in any given country, look at what's already formed, whether it's Lions or indeed whatever sort of club it is, and build on that. And I think that's been a really valuable lesson I learned only a couple of years ago. You think I would have learned it earlier on, but it's a really important one. So thank you very much for the question. I'm afraid I must leave.
Thank you, Sebastian. And we are now 8 minutes past the hour. So I do want to thank our speakers, Sebastian, Hans-Peter, and Veronica, for their insights. And of course, the audience for your active participation. It's been great to have you on the line. We will share the recording and the business brief with all the participants after the webinar. So you can expect to receive an email from us. And we'd love to also get your feedback on what else or what more could we do to help you navigate this space. You can reach out to OCHA or CBI. We'll also include the contact details in that email. Now, without further ado, thank you again for having taken the time to join this session today, and enjoy the rest of the day. Bye, everyone.